heard of the breathtaking cliffs and beaches of southern Portugal called the Algarve Region, but perhaps you didn't know that there's a beautiful long-distance trail that takes you to the interior for a more authentic Portuguese experience away from the touristy crowds. Today, we hiked the Via Algarviana, an almost 300-kilometer, about 185-mile trail that you can actually do in 3 8-day segments, or like our guest today, Josh, he walked the whole thing all at once. I can't wait to share it with you, so let's get started. Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. Before we start, I want to ask you if you appreciate not having the show interrupted to hear ads about underwear, mattresses in a box, food delivery services, internet providers, etc. I know I don't like to hear them when I'm listening to shows, and so to cover the costs of this show and the website, I use something called affiliate marketing. That means at no additional cost to you, if you use the links on my website or in my show notes, you're helping to support the program. So if you're booking a tour, buying travel insurance, training, or frankly buying anything on Amazon, if you would please use my links, it would be most appreciated, and you're helping to keep this program and the website ad-free. You can find the links by visiting the resource pages on the activetraveladventures.com website. And can I ask you to please bookmark my Amazon link? If you go to Amazon using my hiking gear link, I get credit for anything you buy, even if you don't choose anything on my link page. I'll put a link in the show notes to the Amazon page, and on there you will find instructions on how to bookmark my Amazon link from your phone or your computer. Thanks so much, and now let's get on with the show. The Algarve region of Portugal is sunny with pleasant temperatures most of the year. I personally would avoid the summer months, even though it generally doesn't get over 85 degrees Fahrenheit, even in July, because this way when you're at the coast, you can avoid the European vacationers that bombard it all summer. Spring, fall, and winter are ideal times to explore this stunning region. Unlike most Western European countries, Portugal is pretty affordable. The food is delicious. And even if you can't speak Portuguese, you get around pretty well, and if you download the Google Translate app ahead of time, you're definitely not going to have any problems. I asked Josh to come on the program to tell us about this beautiful trail. Welcome to the program, Josh. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for contacting me and allowing me to do this.
It's great because I would wish I could do all the adventures myself, but unfortunately that's not possible. So I reach out to folks like you to tell us about some great experience and introduce us to one. This was actually, I know that Europe's got some great long distance trails, and I know this region that we're talking about today is Portugal's most popular tourist destination. So before we get started, could you just tell us maybe your age, a little bit about yourself so we know who we're talking with?
Okay, well, I'm 67 years old, and I was 66 when I did this walk. I had retired 2 weeks before I started the walk. I was a meteorologist and oceanographer in my working life.
And now I know too, if I'm doing a little homework on you, that you seem to have a fascination with Portugal. You've done several long distance trails there.
Well, Portugal and Spain. I love walking on the Iberian Peninsula. You know, the people, the scenery, the history, the food, it's all great.
So how did you first discover walking holidays?
Well, you know, in my youth, I did a lot of hiking, and of course we have parts of the Appalachian Trail that go through Connecticut. So I did that, but you know, after being married and having kids, it really took being diagnosed and treated for cancer to make me take a step back from working and say, you know, it's time to do things that I already, always wanted to do. So that's when I started doing the long distance walks and, using the 1 foot abroad / follow the CAMINO folks to arrange the travel. And the first experience was so good that I just kept going. And so the Via Algarviana was the 5th different walk I've taken on the Iberian Peninsula.
How about that? So what is the appeal? What makes it special?
Well, the Via Algarviana, of course, is in the far south of Portugal. And it's a route that's recommended for essentially late fall through late spring. So it's not the normal summertime type travel that's a little bit more crowded. So it's the off season, and it's beautiful country. You know, most people think of the Algarve, they think of the seaside resorts and, all the expats from the UK and things like that that are in the far south. But most of this route is 30 to 20 kilometers north of the coast that actually goes through the mountains. So it's beautiful. The country is very sparsely populated. There's only a few good-sized towns along the route. So it's very different than, let's say, the Camino Portuguese or the Camino Frances or those other routes, particularly in the summer when they're crowded.
Right. It actually gets too hot to do this in the summer, so it's not recommended.
Right.
Now,
It's the same as the Rota Vicentina. It's kind of an off-season walk.
and that makes it especially appealing to a lot of people too. Now, one thing I like about this route is because it is away from the heavily touristed areas, that you're actually getting to see a more more authentic Portugal, shall I say? The people you meet may not necessarily have lots of tourists in their lives, and you said on your blog that even you hardly ran into any through hikers.
Right. And while every day I would see maybe a few mountain bikers or see someone 4x4ing that might go past me, it was really only on the weekends that I would see quite a few day hikers. And I only saw one other through hiker cross paths with them. Now, there may have been other people, a couple of days ahead of me or behind me, with different itineraries, but I didn't walk with anyone. And I only, again, passed one hiker from Canada going the other way in, the reverse direction. And, we had an interesting conversation, but it was mostly solo walking.
And now you also went in January, which is not going to be as popular as going in like the early spring when all the flowers, at least from my research. So if you are somebody that wants to hike with more people around you, you might want to get a little bit closer to the warmer seasons where you'll have a little bit more activity. But if you're looking for a solo hike, then what Josh is doing is fantastic because you have the whole place to yourself.
Right. And there was a fair amount of flower activity, probably not as much as later in the spring, but certainly olive trees were already flowering, and there were a number of other things you saw away that were pretty interesting.
Right, and it doesn't get particularly cold down there, so it's more a matter of too much heat in the summer and then pleasant weather, and that's one reason it's gotten so popular. Is it's got delightful weather almost year round, except for it gets pretty hot July, August.
Well, it was chilly. Again, in January, probably the low temperature at the start of every day was very close to 40 degrees, about, 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. And it would get up to 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 12 or 13 degrees Celsius at the peak of the day. So you would shed a few layers as you went through the day. And it was handy to have gloves at the beginning. And at least in one rather hilly section, there was some snow and ice on the ground and visible on the distant hills as well. So it wasn't what I would say warm, but certainly by the end of every day when you've worked up a full sweat and everything, I was probably down to short sleeves.
Whoa.
But the beginning of the day, I'd have a jacket or a sweater on.
So it sounds like perfect hiking weather.
Yes, very comfortable.
Very nice. And so we didn't really talk about the length of the trails. It's broken into 3 sections. You did all 3, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. It's actually broken into 14 sectors by the trail organization, the Via Algarviana.org folks. And so there's 14 stages. And so they're all set so you can comfortably walk them in a day. They're all kind of between 15 and 30 kilometers in length. There is some challenging terrain along the way. They do warn you about fording the Faupana River. During the year, parts of the year when it's dry, it's probably very simple. If it's been raining, and it had been raining when I got there, it was a little bit challenging to get across that. But other than that, it was really just the steepness, the amount of up and down that was physically challenging.
Okay, I got a couple questions for you. I don't want to forget. All right, number 1, on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being like super challenging, like a Mont Blanc or something like that, and 1 being like couch potato, where would you put the overall? And then because 1 Foot Abroad does break into 3 sections, are there differences in difficulty between the sections?
I don't think there's differences in difficulty. There's probably at least 1 or 2 stages in each of the parts that is a little bit difficult. There is a very good guidebook that is put out by the organization, the Via Algarviana.org. And, it's a couple hundred pages, actually. It's a free PDF from their website, and it describes each of the sections that you would either walk, the auxiliary sections, and also the sections you would do if you're riding a bicycle, a mountain bike type thing. And they rate each of the sectors separately in terms of difficulty, and they have some formula that's related to distance and how much accumulated climb and accumulated descent they have. And when they say it's very difficult, it's a long day and it's very difficult.
If you had to put a number on the whole thing.
Well, on the whole thing, I would say probably 3.5.
Okay.
Although some days it was probably 4.5.
Okay, so this is not something you just say, oh, I think I'm going to go walk this. You need to train. I'll put a link to some training information on the show notes. And another thing I want to talk about too, you mentioned the rivers. I don't want to bypass that because you do afford a lot of streams. I did an episode of my companion podcast on how to cross a river. I'll put links to that in the show note as well, because that could be a little dicey. And particularly if you're solo, I would like to talk a little bit more about that one river. Is there an alternative if, let's say, you were there in January and it seems to rain the most November, December, and so you had at least from Weather Sparks, what I could read from there, the highest opportunity of having to cross a river. Could you talk about that?
So most of the streams and rivers have these cement stepping stones that go across. And so even if the water is, a foot or two high, you can still hop across. The Fopana, the Ria Fopana, did not have those. And the trail just goes to the river, and there's a lot of rocks and stuff. And I'm sure, again, in a dry season, you could probably hop across without too much trouble, but it was a little bit higher. I did have walking sticks, trekking poles, and that's what I use to maintain my balance. I did have to take my boots off. I wear a foot brace on my left foot to compensate for foot drop. And so I didn't want to get all that stuff wet. And so I took it off and, made it across. The water was a little over my knees in places. And, but there is a road that you can take across. It's kind of a few kilometers before the crossing that you'd have to get up on the road. And there's an elevated bridge that goes across the river. And then you'd have to, on the other side, find your way back to the trail. So that might be a little challenging as well.
But if it's a choice between, I think it's too high or not, so you put in some extra miles just for your safety.
So if it has been raining, and the folks on the ground there, normally it's, I think, Proactive Tour is one of the companies that One Foot Abroad uses. And they were the folks on the ground. They would give you your packet and your topo maps and things like that, and they would advise you as to whether things were bad or not. And maybe they just thought I was a rough and tough guy, but it wasn't really a problem. It probably took me half an hour, 45 minutes to take the stuff off, get across, and put myself back together, and then continue on the trail.
And then that's one good thing about using a service like One Foot Abroad. You have somebody 24/7 to ask questions, and also ask the locals as well.
Right. And so once you're on the ground, it would be the folks from Proactive Tour. And my main point of contact there was a guy named Bruno Rodriguez, and he was very good. And he's fluent in English, so there were no communications problems.
That's cool. Now let's talk a little bit about, too, you're not backpacking. They're moving your luggage for you, aren't they?
Right. And so you just carry a day pack with your necessary stuff. One unusual thing about the Via Algarviana is that there are very few places to stop. And so all of your accommodations prepare a lunch for you. Part of your packet is a cloth lunch sack. And so each of the places prepare a very hearty sandwich, a couple of pieces of fruit, maybe a small fruit drink, and of course, some bottled water for you to take with you. And, that's kind of a nice touch.
And since we're talking about food, how is the food?
Well, it's very good. It's normally pretty basic in terms of, it's not like French cooking. It's a little bit simpler and more straightforward, but it's wonderful food. It's always fresh. and I enjoy it very much.
And you're in a bit of an agricultural area too, and also a lot of cheese making and wine making. So there's a lot of local specialties that you could explore.
Yes, and there's a lot of apiaries and honey production in the Algarve as well. And you see a lot of beekeeping. As you walk along, you see almond trees, olive trees, figs, carob, some of the prickly pear cactus, and something called strawberry tree. I don't know if you're familiar with
I
that.
saw it. I'm not familiar with the plant. What is that? I
Well,
saw a picture.
it's a large shrub or tree, and it has these red fruits, and it's growing wild, and so it's not necessarily cultivated or harvested. So the ones that haven't been harvested, obviously the birds have been feasting on it. You see it on the ground and on the tree, but they're interesting looking plants. And of course, there is more organized cultivation of things like citrus and vineyards, but all of the other things, the almonds, olives, figs, carob, and those things are just growing in what may have once been a farm way in the past, but is kind of now abandoned. And so they're just growing wild. And of course, there's also a lot of cork.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because that's what I remember most about when my parents got back from Portugal, is all these really cool cork things they brought. So what is cork? And tell us about what you see when you come into the cork areas.
Well, again, some of it is isolated. In other parts, it's grown as part of groves or forests. They don't like to be too close together. Cork is a evergreen oak tree that has very thick bark. And what they do is they strip a portion of the main trunk and maybe some of the larger branches, but not the whole tree, every, let's say, 8 or 9 years. It depends on the temperature. In some places in North Africa, it's every 7 years. And as you go north in Portugal, it goes from 8 years to every 9 years that they would harvest it. And then they paint a number on the tree, probably the year that they last harvested, just the last digit of the year, so they know when they'll next do it.
And they're basically just taking the bark off a section of the tree.
Yes, it's a very manual process. There's no automation or machines that are involved in this. So it's essentially expert labor that harvests the cork, and then it goes to processing centers because there's different grades and it goes into different types of products.
And I think too, because of all the citrus and the almonds and all that, when those are in bloom, I'll bet you it's a heavenly aroma.
Yes, and like I said, some of the olive trees, the wild olives or the abandoned olives, let's say, were already blooming when I was walking along, and I'm pretty sure one of the photos I gave you shows that.
So we talked about food. How about the lodging? Because you're in these small villages, what can we expect?
Well, it varies quite a bit. Some of it is in much older facilities that are obviously dated, but still very comfortable. Some of them didn't really have central heating, so they were a little bit on the chilly side, but all of them had plenty of hot water. And the ones that had dining facilities co-located, the food was wonderful.
Are these guest houses? Are they B&Bs or is it a variety?
It is a variety. Some of them are what look like large farmhouses that have guest quarters in a wing. Others are very old hotel type buildings, maybe 150 years old in a very small town. Others are like a modern apartment or something very similar to a condo that are someplace. So there's a wide variety.
But would you say, as a rule, they're clean, comfortable, and
Yes, they're all clean. They're all very comfortable. I think the organization that kind of set up the whole trail. One thing about the Via Algarviana is it is a relatively recent development. It actually started being developed in the 1990s. So it's really only 30 years old. Now, many of the actual trails in it are older than that, but the organization and kind of the setting up the stages and making sure there were places to stay, I think is a more recent development.
Cool. And I saw too many references to it being the backbone of the Algarve, because there's lots of trails that lead into it. So there's little spurs too.
Yes, there's a lot of.
If you wanted to see a certain area, you could take. Okay, I'm going to start this trail again in a couple of days. I'm going to take this spur to such and such a place.
Right. If you had a lot of time and you really wanted to do that. And of course, in my case, I wanted to walk all the way to Cape St. Vincent. So I had an arranged itinerary and I didn't take too many of the side trails.
Right. But that is a possibility, provided you plan in advance if you're having arrangements and luggage moved for you.
You could take more than a month to do this.
Right. And how long did it take you? And what was the total miles/kilometers?
Well, I took the 14 stages, so it was just a little bit short of 300 kilometers or 180 miles. You may have read or heard about the big fires in the Algarve in 2018. And so the stage that would normally go into Silvis and from Silvis to Monchique have been modified slightly so that you avoid the fire damaged areas. And, those will probably come back at some point, maybe even this year or next year, or, whenever COVID ends. But I also provided a picture of some of the trail markers that were damaged by the fires.
And speaking of trail markers, how well marked is it? Did you ever feel like, oh, I'm lost, or tell us about that?
It is very well marked for the most part. There were a few glitches. There was one point where I found an area where the markers put you in a kind of an endless loop, a little circle, about a kilometer in length. But eventually I found a marker that was damaged and, took some photos and provided it back to the people as feedback. But they provide topographic maps. So you kind of know that, well, I should be going straight and crossing this river instead of following this sign that sends me back the way I went, so it's not too hard to figure out. And there was only maybe 2 instances where I had to pull out the map and really study the situation.
What would be a typical day mileage wise or time wise as a general rule? I know some days are harder and easier than others, but
right.
About how long are you out on the trail?
I would say about 6 hours generally, some days a little bit longer, some days a little bit less. And they don't rush breakfast in the morning. So you're not going to eat before 8 a.m. if they're, providing your breakfast. And so you normally hit the road around 9 and you walk. And the only concern I had in January was on the very longest days, which are about 29, 30 kilometers, was making sure I finished before dark.
Right.
And it never became an issue, but it was something I worried about at the beginning.
Right. And that's still like just under 15 miles, if I'm not mistaken.
30 kilometers is just a little over 18 miles.
Oh, 18 miles. So that's a long day. That's a long day. And I
Yes.
saw on one of the sections that was a long day that they offer, if you don't want to do the full day, we can arrange a transport.
Right. Well, and there were other transfers, for example, the sections around Silvis. So you had to stop at Funchal Dam. And so then they gave you a transfer to your lodging. And then the next morning, a transfer to the other side of Silvis to avoid the fire damage, to start somewhere else and do that. And so, yes. And so there was another day where I stayed in the same lodging twice. I think it was Cachopo, walked to Cachopo, and then they brought me back to the lodging I had the previous night, and then they transferred me back there. So it is possible to get in advance if you think there's going to be a difficult section or a section that's too long.
Or do they give you when you start that if for some reason, let's say your ankle's a little sore or whatever, if you want to just take a rest day that wasn't planned to get ahead by some kind of a bus or taxi or something?
Yeah, in this area, it'd probably be a taxi, and you'd probably have to arrange that on your own. They do the luggage transfer and any people transfers that are part of the itinerary or planned, but if you had to find another way to get there, you'd probably have to arrange that yourself.
Right. But generally speaking, in my experience, it's always arrangeable. So if for some reason you just can't, but
Yes.
I also like taking a rest day too every once in a while, like one day a week at least. I'd like to take one day. Is there certain villages that you'd say, oh, if you want to take a rest day, these are the pretty ones?
Well, Silvis is a good sized town, and that would be a very good one. I had very comfortable accommodations in Salir and Alte, and they would be good places to take a day. I normally like to walk all the way through, but if you were to go through one of the services like One Foot Abroad, you could obviously plan those.
Yeah, that's what I did with my West Highland Way.
Monchique.
Although the drawback is if you do meet people on the trail and you've taken a rest day and they haven't, then you've lost your new friends, but you make new
Right.
ones. So it's a trade-off. Let's talk about
Monchique is
Sorry?
also a very good town to stop in. It has a lot of restaurants and services.
Cool. Is there much of a language barrier?
No, I normally try to bone up on my Portuguese, by reviewing the little guidebook things I have, and I'll use Babbel. This is my fifth walk on the Iberian Peninsula, so I'm kind of used to it. I would warn people that written Portuguese and the way you might decide to say things is not the way you're going to hear things. But in most cases, you make a good effort in Portuguese, they may answer you in English, but there's usually no problem communicating.
Good. And I think that's also part of the fun too when you travel.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about the local folks. Can you give us some examples of some interactions that you might have had?
Oh, yes. Well, for example, in Monchique, the proprietress of the Albergue Bicaboa is actually from County Clare in Ireland. And, she married a Portuguese man a long time ago. But my wife's mother is also from County Clare. So we had something to talk about there. I see a lot of our agricultural workers, and they're sometimes curious as to where you're from, and so you speak some with them. On my last day, I came across a horse that was herding cattle by himself.
That's funny.
And several hundred yards behind him were the actual person herder and a few more dogs. And then I had an interesting conversation where I was asking him whether the horse was actually doing the herding, and he told me that the horse thought he was a dog. He learned it from the dogs, and he kind of took over the job all by himself. But there's a ton of interesting people, and generally people are very friendly wherever you are. And the few places where you could stop and grab a snack or something like that, they were always very friendly. Everyone was friendly along the way. And I would say because I was walking alone and they hadn't seen many walkers yet, that part of the year, everyone was pretty interested in what I was doing.
Do you need to bring cash, or do they use debit cards or credit cards, or how do you pay for things in these small towns?
Well, I normally bring a couple €100 in cash and have the credit cards. Along the way, about half the nights, the dinner was arranged as part of the lodging, or in a facility very close to lodging. It was prepaid. All the breakfasts were prepaid, and of course all the lunches were prepaid. So it's really just incidentals along the way, and half the meals that you had to worry about paying.
And let's talk a little bit about wildlife. What did you see?
Well, in addition to all the plants, I did see a fair number of birds of prey like hawks in various places, a lot of smaller songbirds. In one instance, in going from Barranco Velo to the next stop, Salir, on that one, you walk on this very high ridge walking toward the west, and there's a deep valley to your south toward the ocean. And there were tens of thousands of migrating birds. They look like Arctic terns that were below you. So they weren't flying at your level or above you. They were flying down in this valley below you. And then as you're walking along, the trail starts to dip down, and that's where all these birds chose to turn to go to the north. So they're crossing over the trail. And that was a very interesting spectacle.
I'll bet.
And they were
a big birding area.
Right. And they were far enough away that at the beginning, you really didn't know what kind of birds they were. But by the time you started going down from the top, they were actually flying right over you. And in some cases, 10, 15 feet above you as they crossed over the ridge. So it was very interesting.
That's cool. So let's talk about the terrain a little bit. So there's a lot of ups and downs. Is it rocky? Is it covered in vegetation, or what does it look like?
Well, most of the trails look like dirt tracks, or what they'd call in the US, I guess, a dirt road type thing. And so there's a fair amount of broken and loose stone that's on many of them. So you do have to kind of walk carefully to make sure you don't twist an ankle or something like that. But it's not like big river stones or cobbles or something like that. Footing was normally not a problem.
Okay, and how about the surrounding landscape? What are you seeing?
Well, some parts are forested, some parts are open grazing land, or just uncultivated natural vegetation. In fact, that's many of the areas where you saw the beehives were set out so they could take advantage of the natural flowering plants. Things like rosemary, thyme, lavender, heather are all kind of natural plants that you would see all over the place.
Are you exposed most of the time to the sun, or often in canopy, or how about that?
I would say more exposed than under the canopy, but it varies by section. Some sections are well forested, other parts are more out in the open.
Okay.
Particularly in the agricultural section. So the first half of the walk, let's say, is more in the country, forested, things like that. And then when you get into the areas that are more heavily agricultural, then it's a little more open.
All right. And then I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, as you get closer to the coast, it's going to get more populated because the tourists are and the second home people are down there. So it's going to be more built up and more restaurants, more activities.
Yes, but you really don't see that probably until I'm trying to think where the best breaking point. When you leave Bensafrim and head toward Vila de Bispo is the last town before you get out to Cape St. Vincent. That's when you start seeing the golf clubs, the condo things, restaurants, but the trail stays well away from those for the most part. So you're still walking in isolation for the most part until you get into Vila de Bispo, where they have restaurants and a very nice hotel.
And then what's it like when you finally make it to the sea?
Oh, the cliffs at Cape St. Vincent are stunning, and you're at least 100 or several hundred feet up from the ocean. The waves are crashing. Just beautiful vistas. It's and the countryside going toward it, because you're finally getting to the coast. It's kind of the windswept landscape, no trees or very stunted trees, and very different types of plants than you've seen along the way. But it's still very nice.
As you're approaching, how far in advance can you see that you're finally made it to the ocean?
Several kilometers away. It is kind of interesting because if you were to take the Rota Vicentina, it would also stop in Vila de Bispo. And then there are a number of trails you can take between Vila de Bispo and Cape St. Vincent. Some stay up on the high ground, others go closer to the ocean and are much more rugged. But you can kind of see the end quite a long ways off. I would say at least maybe an hour or two before you finally arrive at Cape St. Vincent. You know that you're getting down to the end of the peninsula. You can actually see the ocean on both sides.
That's really cool. I love that. All right. So not everybody can take as much time off as you did. So if we were to break it into the 3 sections that One Foot Abroad does, do they have different personalities? So if somebody says, I can only do one section, can you tell me which would be the prettiest? Which would be the best for, just, do they have little personalities to help us pick which is the best section to do?
Well, they do.
For our needs. Yeah.
And so, for example, the first section that starts in Al-Kutim is on the Guadiana River. And right across the river, 100 yards away, is Sanlúcar, Spain, Sanlúcar de Guadiana, Spain. And, they have a history of, before the European Union, smuggling across the border. And so they still, even though they don't have to do it anymore, that's still their big festival in the summertime. It's their history of smuggling between the two towns. And it is the least densely populated area of Portugal. So like for the first 2 days, you take your lunch, and the only place you could possibly have something else to eat is when you arrive at your destination, other than what you're carrying with you. So I like that. It was very nice. You wouldn't want to miss Cape St. Vincent in my estimation. So if you only had to pick one of the sections, I guess I would pick that one because the scenery is stunning. But I enjoyed all of it.
And there's a ton of history in that area because it's been ruled by all sorts of different civilizations over time. Could you see that in your walk, that all of a sudden, oh, this is definitely Roman, or this is definitely the Moors?
Yes.
This is, talk about that.
Right. So Al-Qutim has an Arabic name because it was ruled by the Moors, and the largest feature in town is a castle that is a Moorish defensive castle. From there, you can look across the river. You can see the old historic windmills that they use for grinding grain. But as you walk out of town, you pass a section that has menhirs, which are like Stonehenge. They're vertical stones that are set in the ground. I don't know if you remember the old Asterix comics, with Obelix and Asterix. They were Gauls, but Obelix was a guy who carried menhirs around. He built and carried menhirs. So this is kind of a thing. They're prehistoric. They're pre-Roman. So there's the prehistoric stuff. There's Roman influence in ruins. There's obviously the Arabic influence, and it is very historic.
That's very cool. And what about the villages themselves? I've been to Portugal on the coast. I've been to Lisbon, but I haven't been down that section at all. Is there a particular style of the village that you would say, like when I was in Scotland, I was in a medieval village every time. I was like, there hasn't been a new building here in God knows how long. They're all 500 years old. What are you seeing when you come to the villages?
There's a mixture of old traditional architecture and newer stuff. I'm trying to think if I describe any of them as being particularly scenic, and I'm not sure I would. Obviously in Al-Qutim, there was, historic architecture in many places, but newer stuff. Some of the other cities like Monchique, there were things like the hotel, the Bica Boa, that was obviously an old structure, probably from the beginning of the century or even the late 19th century. But there were also newer, more modern construction as well. But you do pass a lot of ruined farmhouses, old churches, some of these defensive fortifications. So it's a mixture of architecture. It's not like Cinque Terre or some of these very touristy, scenic places that you might think of. It's a little more rustic, I guess.
This sounds very appealing to me. And you did this solo. Is this something that you feel comfortable saying solo people can do this?
Yes, but again, I've done walks both ways. I've done 4 of my walks solo and 1 with one of my adult sons. But in a different time of the year, there could be more people. It'd be nice to have someone to walk this with if you're comfortable doing that. So again, it's not as social as, let's say, the main CAMINO routes during the summer.
Right.
You have to be comfortable with yourself, I guess.
And sometimes that's what people are looking for anyway.
Yes.
So, and if you wanted to meet more people on the trail, just do it a little bit closer to the summertime. When I think April, May, June are the busiest months to do it, and September, October are the second busiest times. Although September looked like there was still not the best in some sections. So if you're doing the whole thing, I would.
Right. They warn you that September and October can still be quite warm.
Yeah. So I would go really the spring. I would do winter through spring if I had to, my druthers, just from what I could see on the weather research I did. So was there something you wish you'd known before you'd gone that you could tell us, oh, I wish I'd known this, so that we don't make the same?
Well, there were a few instances where I wish I had had a head-mounted flashlight, headlight type thing. And that was really to go between, let's say, where I was eating and my residence in the cases where some of the cities are not very well lit. And if you're carrying stuff, you don't necessarily want to hold a flashlight, or, using a cell phone light isn't the best way to do that. So I think I might do that, particularly in light of the short days. There was another case where I was staying at a very nice hotel in a kind of isolated cabin, and I had to walk down to a common dining facility. I was the only person staying there. It was otherwise completely abandoned. The people had given me my dinner ahead of time and the materials for my lunch, and it was all in the fridge, but I had to get between where I was staying and where I was eating, and it was pitch black. So a little bit challenging.
And that actually, a headlamp is something I recommend you put even in your day pack if you don't think you're going to need it. That's part of like my essentials of my emergency kit. I'll put a link to my emergency kit in the show notes as well, because you don't need it most of the time, but when you need it, you really need it.
Right. But it's not like some of the younger kids on the Caminos where they want to get up at before dawn and start so they don't miss getting to the next hostel or whatever. It's not like that. It's really just, oh, I wish I had better light, walking around town after dark.
Right. And like you said, if you don't have a lot of food options anyway, and the breakfast is included and they don't start till 8, you really don't have the option unless you're going to skip breakfast, which is not a good idea.
Right. No.
Except to wait until their breakfast time.
Right.
So anything else that you would have brought? Either clothing ideas or footwear? What kind of footwear did you wear, and would you recommend that?
Well, I have mid-height boots. I'm kind of prefer the Merrell Moab type boots, and it's what I've always worn. And I find them very comfortable and they wear well. Layers, in this kind of thing where it's going to go from 40 degrees early in the morning to, 55 or 60 in the afternoon, you have to be able to adjust your clothing so you don't overheat. So layers is important. And some of the residential things along the way were a bit on the chilly side. So if you're a person who's not real warm, and I know like my wife isn't very warm most of the time, you might want to have a set of thermal underwear or something to wear at night.
Yeah, and particularly you said some of them weren't necessarily heated or...
Well, they didn't have central heating,
heat.
I guess is the best way to say it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and like I said, they're moving your luggage anyway, so it's not a bad idea to do that. And I even though you were doing in the winter time, but even in the spring, I've got a thermal jacket that packs the size of my palm basically, because if you've been sweating and you sit down to rest, you get cold. So,
right.
And again, if something goes wrong and you got to spend the night somehow or whatever, you want that jacket. So
and a couple of days I had very heavy rain. I mean, torrential rain, in fact. And so whatever clothes I was actually wearing that day had to be dried. Luckily, I was able to do that at my lodging, where the people were very accommodating and threw the stuff in the dryer so that I didn't have to pack it away wet because it was raining so hard. There was no way to dry it otherwise.
So how does this adventure compare to some of your other hikes? Give us some of your impressions on, oh man, this is great, you got to do it, or tell us what you feel about that.
It's an, oh great, you have to do it, I think. For parts of it, you're in the mountains and, occasionally from the mountains or the ridges, you can actually see all the way south to the ocean. But generally, you're quite a ways from the ocean until you get down at the very end of Cape St. Vincent. But the scenery is great and the food is great and the people are great. So I would compare it very favorably to other walks. I would have to say, though, my favorites were the Rota Vicentina, where you're really walking cliffside on the ocean for a long distance, and the Camino del Norte, where you're doing something very similar on the Bay of Biscay, where you walk from the French border all across northern Spain, within sight of the coast for a very long distance. And I find that kind of appealing, but I was in the Navy for a long time, so I like seeing the ocean.
And I actually did cover the Rota I might be saying it wrong. I called it Rota Vincentina, but apparently that's the wrong pronunciation.
Vicentina.
I will put a link to that in the show notes too, because that when I interviewed Julianne about that, that sounded just gorgeous too.
Yeah.
So when did you do that?
I did that in the spring of 2018.
That looks really cool. So what's next?
Well, I'd like to do the Camino Primitivo, which goes from Oviedo, Spain, it's kind of the last segment of the Camino del Norte. And then after that, I think there's a few walks I'd like to do in the UK, in Cornwall, Wales, across Scotland, things like that.
Nice. Yeah, I did the West Highland Way. Highly recommended.
Yeah.
It's lovely. So any final words or advice that you can give us about hiking the Via Algarve?
It's a great thing to do. It can get you out of the doldrums in the late fall and winter and early spring, to get the kind of exercise you'd like to get. You don't have to wait until summertime. You can do it then.
Very nice. Thank you, Josh, for your time. I appreciate it. We'll have to get you back after your next adventure.
All right. Take care, Kit.
I hope you've enjoyed hearing about Josh's adventures on the Via Algarviana. You can get more details and see some of Josh's pictures on the activetraveladventures.com website. Don't forget that if you arrange your self-guided tour with my affiliate, One Foot Abroad, use the promo code ATA5, ATA5, to get 5% off. If you don't have a pencil handy, just go to the resources pages and you will find it there. Finally, I get emails all the time asking me questions about adventure travel, and then when I write back, I often get a quick response to the effect that, hey, they're surprised I actually answered them. Truly, I do love to hear from you, and I do try to be as helpful as I can. So if you've got a question or a suggestion for the show, please don't hesitate to write me at kit@activetraveladventures.com. Even though this is a podcast, I want to try to make it a two-way street. I really appreciate you listening. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on.